Welcome to From River to Kingdom, Egypt's ancient story. In the next few minutes, you'll discover how the Nile River not only shaped the landscape of ancient Egypt but also laid the foundation for one of the world's first great civilizations. Have you ever wondered how a river could influence politics, culture, and daily life in such a profound way? What secrets does the Nile hold about the oldest inhabitants of this valley? As we explore these questions, you'll gain insights into the remarkable journey from a simple river to a powerful kingdom. This video combines soothing narration, calming visuals, and ambient soundscapes to create a unique experience that helps you relax while learning. If you enjoy exploring ancient history in a tranquil setting, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more captivating stories from antiquity. Let's dive in.
History of Egypt, Chaldea, Syria, Babylonia, and Assyria, Volume 1 by Gaston Maspero. Part 1, The Nile and Egypt. A long, low, level shore, barely rising above the sea, a chain of vaguely defined and ever-shifting lakes and marshes, then the triangular plain beyond, its apex thrust 30 leagues into the land. This is the delta of Egypt, gradually acquired from the sea, and, as it were, the gift of the Nile. The Mediterranean once reached to the foot of the sandy plateau where the pyramids now stand, forming a wide gulf where today stretches plain beyond the delta. The last undulations of the Arabian hills, from Gebel Mokattam to Gebel Jennefer, were its eastern boundaries, while a winding, shallow channel, running between Africa and Asia, connected the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. Westward, the coastline closely followed the contour of the Libyan plateau, but a long limestone spur broke away at about 31 degrees north and ended in Cape Abuker. Alluvial deposits first filled the depths of the bay and then, under the influence of currents sweeping along its eastern coasts, accumulated behind a rampart of sand hills, whose remains are still visible near Benha. Thus, a miniature delta was formed, its structure closely matching that of the Great Delta today. Here, the Nile divided into three diverging streams, roughly coinciding with the southern courses of the Rosetta and Damietta branches and with the modern canal of Abu Menega. The ceaseless accumulation of mud brought down by the river soon extended beyond its initial limits, steadily encroaching upon the sea until it was carried past the shelter provided by Cape Abuker. Then, it was gathered into the great coastal current flowing from Africa to Asia, forming a curved coastline ending in the headland of Cassios, on the Syrian frontier. From that time, Egypt made no further increase to the north, and its coast remains practically as it was thousands of years ago. Only the interior has changed, having dried up, hardened, and gradually risen. Its inhabitants believed they could measure the exact time this work of creation had taken. According to the Egyptians, Menes, the first of their mortal kings, had, so they said, found the valley under water. The sea reached almost as far as the Fayum, and, except for the province of Thebes, the entire country was a pestilential swamp. Hence, the period necessary for Egypt's physical formation would cover some centuries after Menes. This is no longer considered a sufficient length of time, and some modern geologists declare that the Nile must have worked at the formation of its estuary for at least 74,000 years. This figure is certainly exaggerated, for the alluvium would gain on the shallows of the ancient Gulf far more rapidly than it gains upon the depths of the Mediterranean. But even if we reduce the period, we must still admit that the Egyptians little suspected the true age of their country. Not only did the delta long precede the coming of Menes, but its plan was entirely completed before the first arrival of the Egyptians. The Greeks, full of the mysterious virtues they attributed to numbers, discovered that there were 7 principal branches and 7 mouths of the Nile, and that, compared to these, the rest were merely false mouths. As a matter of fact, there were only 3 chief outlets. The Canopic branch flowed westward, falling into the Mediterranean near Cape Abuker, at the western end of the arc described by the coastline. The Pelusiac branch followed the length of the Arabian chain, flowing out at the other extremity. And the Sebennytic stream almost bisected the triangle contained between the Canopic and Pelusiac channels. 2,000 years ago, these branches separated from the main river at the city of Circasoros, nearly 4 miles north of the site where Cairo now stands. But after the Pelusiac branch ceased to exist, the fork of the river gradually wore away the land from age to age and is now some 9 miles lower down. These 3 great waterways are united by a network of artificial rivers and canals, and by ditches, some natural, others dug by human hands, but all ceaselessly shifting. They silt up, close, open again, replace each other, and branch out into innumerable courses over the soil, spreading life and fertility everywhere. As the land rises to the south, this web contracts and becomes less confused, while black soil and cultivation alike dwindle, and the fawn-colored line of the desert comes into sight. The Libyan and Arabian hills appear above the plain, draw nearer to each other, and gradually enclose the horizon until it seems as though they would unite. And there the delta ends, and Egypt proper begins. It is only a strip of rich earth stretching north and south between regions of drought and desolation, a prolonged oasis on the banks of the river, created and sustained by the Nile. The entire length of the land is enclosed between two ranges of hills, roughly parallel at an average distance of about 12 miles. During earlier ages, the river filled all this intermediate space, and the hillsides, polished, worn, and blackened to their very summits, still bear unmistakable traces of its action. Wasted and shrunken within the depths of its ancient bed, the stream now carves a path through its own thick deposits of mud. The bulk of its waters keeps to the east and constitutes the true Nile, the great river of the hieroglyphic inscriptions. A second arm flows close to the Libyan desert, here and there formed into canals, elsewhere left to follow its own course. From the head of the delta to the village of Demt, it is called the Bar Yusuf, beyond Dirut, up to Gebel Silsili, it is the Ibrahimia, the Sohagia, the Rayan. But the ancient names are unknown to us. This western Nile dries up in winter throughout its upper courses. Where it continues to flow, it does so by scanty additions from the main Nile. It also divides north of Hennessy and, through the gorge of Ilahun, sends out a branch that passes beyond the hills into the basin of the Fayum. The true Nile, the eastern Nile, is less a river than a winding lake, encumbered with islets and sandbanks. Its navigable channel twists capriciously between them, flowing with a strong and steady current below the steep, black banks cut sheer through the alluvial earth. There are light groves of date palms, groups of acacia trees and sycamores, square patches of barley or wheat, fields of beans or of bersim, and here and there a long bank of sand that the least breeze raises into whirling clouds. And over all, a great silence broods, scarcely broken by the cry of birds or the song of rowers in a passing boat. Something of human life may stir on the banks, but distance softens it into poetry. A half-veiled woman, bearing a bundle of herbs upon her head, drives her goats before her. An irregular line of donkeys or laden camels emerges from one hollow of the undulating road only to disappear into another. A group of peasants, crouched upon the shore in the ancient posture of knees to chin, patiently awaits the return of the ferryboat. A dainty village looks forth smiling from beneath its palm trees. Close up, it is all naked filth and ugliness, a cluster of low grey huts built of mud and laths, 2 or 3 taller, whitewashed houses, an enclosed square shaded by sycamores, a few old men, each seated peacefully at his own door, a confusion of fowls, children, goats, and sheep, half a dozen boats tied ashore. But, as we pass on, the wretchedness fades away, meanness of detail is lost in light, and long before it disappears at a bend of the river, the village is again clothed with gaiety and serene beauty. Day by day, the landscape repeats itself. The same groups of trees alternate with the same fields, growing green or dusty in the sunlight according to the season. With the same measured flow, the Nile winds beneath its steep banks and around its scattered islands. One village succeeds another, each alike smiling and squalid under its crown of foliage. The terraces of the Libyan hills, beyond the western Nile, barely rise above the horizon, lying like a white edging between the green of the plain and the blue of the sky. The Arabian hills do not form one unbroken line but a series of mountain masses with their spurs, now approaching the river, now withdrawing to the desert at almost regular intervals. At the entrance to the valley, rise Gebel Mokattam and Gebel El Ahmar. Gebel Hemer Shamol and Gebel Shek Mbarak next stretch in echelon from north to south and are succeeded by Gebel Etitur, where, according to an old legend, all the birds of the world are annually assembled. Then follows Gebel Abufida, dreaded by sailors for its sudden gusts. Limestone predominates throughout, white or yellowish, broken by veins of alabaster or of red and gray sandstones. Its horizontal strata are so symmetrically laid one above another as to seem more like the walls of a town than the side of a mountain. But time has often dismantled their summits and loosened their foundations. Man has broken into their facades to cut his quarries and his tombs, while the current secretly undermines the base, where it has made many a breach. As soon as any margin of mud has collected between cliffs and river, halfa grass and wild plants take hold upon it, and date palms grow there, whence their seed, no one knows. Presently, a hamlet rises at the mouth of the ravine, among clusters of trees and miniature fields. Beyond Syed, the light becomes more glowing, the air drier and more vibrant, and the green of cultivation loses its brightness. The angular outline of the dom palm mingles more and more with that of the common palm and the heavy sycamore, and the castor oil plant increasingly abounds. But all these changes come about so gradually that they are effected before we notice them. The plain continues to contract. At Thebes, it is still 10 miles wide. At the gorge of Jebelin, it has almost disappeared, and at Gebel Silsili, it has completely vanished. There, it was crossed by a natural dike of sandstone, through which the waters have with difficulty scooped for themselves a passage. From this point, Egypt is nothing but the bed of the Nile lying between two escarpments of naked rock. Further on, the cultivable land reappears, but narrowed and changed almost beyond recognition. Hills, hewn out of solid sandstone, succeed each other at distances of about 2 miles, low, crushed, somber, and formless. Presently, a forest of palm trees, the last on that side, announces Aswan and Nubia. 5 banks of granite, ranging in lines between latitude 24 and 18 degrees north, cross Nubia from east to west and from northeast to southwest, like so many ramparts thrown up between the Mediterranean and the heart of Africa. The Nile has attacked them from behind, making its way over them one after another in rapids that have been glorified by the name of cataracts. Classic writers were pleased to describe the river as hurled into the gulfs of Syene with so great a roar that the people of the neighborhood were deafened by it. Even a colony of Persians, sent there by Cambyses, could not bear the noise of the falls, and went forth to seek a quieter situation. The first cataract is a kind of sloping and winding passage 6¼ miles in length, descending from the island of Philae to the port of Aswan, the approach brightened by the evergreen groves of Elephantine. Beyond Elephantine are cliffs and sandy beaches, chains of blackened roches moutonnées, marking out the beds of the currents, and fantastic reefs, sometimes bare and sometimes veiled by long grasses and climbing plants, in which thousands of birds have made their nests. There are islets, too, occasionally large enough to have once supported a population, such as Amarate, Salug, and Sihel. The granite threshold of Nubia is broken beyond Sihel, but its debris, massed in disorder against the right bank, still seem to dispute the passage of the waters, dashing turbulently and roaring as they flow along through tortuous channels, where every streamlet is broken up into small cascades. The channel running by the left bank is always navigable. During the inundation, the rocks and sandbanks of the right side are completely under water, their presence only betrayed by eddies. But when the river reaches its lowest point, a fall of some 6 feet is established, and there, big boats, hugging the shore, are hauled up by means of ropes or easily drift down with the current. All kinds of granite are found together in this corner of Africa, the pink and red syenites, porphyritic granite, yellow granite, gray granite, both black granite and white, and granites veined with black and veined with white. As soon as these disappear behind us, various sandstones begin to crop up, allied to the coarsest limestone. The hill bristles with small split blocks, with peaks half overturned, with rough and denuded mounds. League beyond league, they stretch in low, ignoble outline. Here and there, a valley opens sharply into the desert, revealing an infinite perspective of summits and escarpments in echelon one behind another to the furthest plane of the horizon, like motionless caravans. The now confined river rushes on with a low, deep murmur, accompanied night and day by the croaking of frogs and the rhythmic creak of the Saki. Jetties of rough stonework, made in unknown times by an unknown people, run out like breakwaters into midstream. From time to time, waves of sand are borne over, drowning the narrow fields of doura and barley. Scraps of close, aromatic pasturage, acacias, date palms, and dom palms, together with a few shriveled sycamores, are scattered along both banks. The ruins of a crumbling pylon mark the site of some ancient city, and, overhanging the water, is a vertical wall of rock honeycombed with tombs. Amid these relics of another age, miserable huts, scattered hamlets, and a town or two surrounded with little gardens are the only evidence that there is yet life in Nubia. South of Wadi Halfa, the second granite bank is broken through, and the second cataract spreads its rapids over a length of 4 leagues. The archipelago numbers more than 350 islets, of which some 60 have houses upon them and yield harvests to their inhabitants. The main characteristics of the first 2 cataracts are repeated with slight variations in the 3 that follow, at Hanak, at Garendid, and El Humar. It is Egypt still, but a joyless Egypt bereft of its brightness, impoverished, disfigured, and almost desolate. There is the same double wall of hills, now closely confining the valley, and again withdrawing from each other as though to flee into the desert. Everywhere are moving sheets of sand, steep black banks with their narrow strips of cultivation, and villages that are scarcely visible on account of the lowness of their huts. Sycamore trees cease at Gebel Barkal, date palms become fewer and finally disappear. The Nile alone has not changed. And it was at Philae, so it is at Berber. Here, however, on the right bank, 600 leagues from the sea, is its first affluent, the Tekaz, which intermittently brings to it the waters of northern Ethiopia. At Khartoum, the single channel in which the river flowed divides, and 2 other streams open up in a southerly direction, each of them apparently equal in volume to the main stream. Which is the true Nile? Is it the Blue Nile, which seems to come down from the distant mountains? Or is it the White Nile, which has traversed the immense plains of equatorial Africa? The old Egyptians never knew. The river kept the secret of its source from them as stubbornly as it withheld it from us until a few years ago. Vainly did their victorious armies follow the Nile for months together as they pursued the tribes who dwelt upon its banks, only to find it as wide, as full, as irresistible in its progress as ever. It was a freshwater sea, and sea, Ioma, was the name by which they called it. The Egyptians therefore never sought its source. They imagined the whole universe to be a large box, nearly rectangular in form, whose greatest diameter was from south to north, and its least from east to west. The earth, with its alternating continents and seas, formed the bottom of the box. It was a narrow, oblong, and slightly concave floor, with Egypt in its center. The sky stretched over it like an iron ceiling, flat according to some, vaulted according to others. Its earthward face was capriciously sprinkled with lamps hung from strong cables, which, extinguished or unperceived by day, were lighted, or became visible to our eyes, at night. Since this ceiling could not remain in mid-air without support, 4 columns, or rather 4 forked trunks of trees, similar to those that maintained the primitive house, were supposed to uphold it. But it was doubtless feared lest some tempest should overturn them, for they were superseded by 4 lofty peaks, rising at the 4 cardinal points and connected by a continuous chain of mountains. The Egyptians knew little of the northern peak, the Mediterranean, the very green, interposed between it and Egypt and prevented their coming near enough to see it. The southern peak was named Apit, the horn of the earth, that on the east was called Baku, the mountain of birth, and the western peak was known as Manu, sometimes as Ankhet, the region of life. Baku was not a fictitious mountain, but the highest of those distant summits seen from the Nile when looking toward the Red Sea. In the same way, Manu corresponded to some hill of the Libyan desert whose summit closed the horizon. When it was discovered that neither Baku nor Manu were the limits of the world, the notion of upholding the celestial roof was not on that account given up. It was only necessary to withdraw the pillars from sight and imagine fabulous peaks, invested with familiar names. These were not supposed to form the actual boundary of the universe. A great river, analogous to the ocean stream of the Greeks, lay between them and its utmost limits. This river circulated upon a kind of ledge projecting along the sides of the box a little below the continuous mountain chain upon which the starry heavens were sustained. To the north of the ellipse, the river was bordered by a steep and abrupt bank, which took its rise at the peak of Manu on the west and soon rose high enough to form a screen between the river and the earth. The narrow valley which it hid from view was known as Da'it from remotest times. Eternal night enfolded that valley in thick darkness and filled it with dense air such that no living thing could breathe. Toward the east, the steep bank rapidly declined and ceased altogether a little beyond Baku, while the river flowed on between low and almost level shores from east to south, and then from south to west. The sun was a disk of fire placed upon a boat. At the same even rate, the river carried it around the ramparts of the world. From evening until morning, it disappeared within the gorges of Da'it. Its light did not then reach us, and it was night. From morning until evening, its rays, being no longer intercepted by any obstacle, were freely shed abroad from one end of the box to the other, and it was day. The Nile branched off from the Celestial River at its southern bend, hence the south was the chief cardinal point to the Egyptians, and by that they oriented themselves, placing sunrise to their left and sunset to their right. Before they passed beyond the defile of Gebel Silsili, they thought that the spot whence the celestial waters left the sky was situated between Elephantine and Philae, and that they descended in an immense waterfall whose last leaps were at Syene. It may be that the tales about the first cataract told by classic writers are but a far-off echo of this tradition of a barbarous age. Conquests carried into the heart of Africa forced the Egyptians to recognize their error, but did not weaken their faith in the supernatural origin of the river. They only placed its source further south and surrounded it with greater marvels. They told how, by going up the stream, sailors at length reached an undetermined country, a kind of borderland between this world and the next, a land of shades, whose inhabitants were dwarfs, monsters, or spirits. Then they passed into a sea sprinkled with mysterious islands, like those enchanted archipelagos which Portuguese and Breton mariners were wont to see at times when on their voyages, and which vanished at their approach. These islands were inhabited by serpents with human voices, sometimes friendly and sometimes cruel to the shipwrecked. He who went forth from the islands could never re-enter them, they were resolved into the waters and lost within the bosom of the waves. A modern geographer can hardly comprehend such fancies, those of Greek and Roman times were perfectly familiar with them. They believed that the Nile communicated with the Red Sea near Suakin by means of the Astaboras, and this was certainly the route which the Egyptians of old had imagined for their navigators. The supposed communication was gradually transferred farther and farther south, and we have only to glance over certain maps of the 16th and 17th centuries to see clearly drawn what the Egyptians had imagined, the center of Africa as a great lake, whence issued the Congo, the Zambezi, and the Nile. Arab merchants of the Middle Ages believed that a resolute man could pass from Alexandria or Cairo to the land of the Zinjas and the Indian Ocean by rising from river to river. Many legends about the Nile's origin are now lost, while others have been gathered and enhanced by Jewish and Christian theologians. The Nile was said to flow from paradise, through impassable fiery regions, before emptying into a sea that led to Egypt. Sometimes, it carried celestial branches and fruits unlike any on earth. The idea of a sea in these tales might not be as far-fetched as it sounds. A lake, almost the size of today's Lake Victoria, once covered the marshy plain where the White Nile meets the Sobat and Bahr el Ghazal rivers. Alluvial deposits have since filled most of it, leaving only its deepest part, known as Birket Nu. But in ages before our era, it must have been vast enough to suggest to Egyptian soldiers and boatmen an actual sea, opening into the Indian Ocean. The mountains vaguely seen to the south, on its far shores, likely concealed its mysterious source. There, the inundation was prepared, and from there, it began on a fixed day. The celestial Nile had its own periodic rise and fall, which the earthly Nile mirrored. Every year, around mid-June, Isis, mourning Osiris, would shed a tear into it. This tear caused the river to swell and descend upon the earth. Isis has had no devotees for centuries, and her name is unknown to her worshippers' descendants. Yet, the tradition of her fertilizing tears lives on. Even today, every Egyptian, Muslim or Christian, knows that a divine drop falls from heaven during the night of June 17th to 18th, causing the Nile to rise. Swollen by rains in February over the Great Lakes region, the White Nile rushes northward, sweeping away stagnant waters left by the previous year's flood. To its left, the Bahr el Ghazal brings overflow from the vast basin between Darfur and the Congo. To its right, the Sobat pours in water from rivers that furrow the southern slopes of the Abyssinian mountains. The first swell passes Khartoum by the end of April, raising the water level by about a foot. It then slowly moves through Nubia, fading in Egypt by early June. These waters, tainted by semi-putrid organic matter from equatorial swamps, retain a greenish tint as far as the delta, even after their long journey. They are rumored to be poisonous, causing severe bladder pain to those who drink them. However, I must say that for 5 years, every June, I drank this green water directly from the Nile, using only the usual precaution of filtering it through a porous jar. Neither I nor my companions ever experienced the slightest discomfort. Fortunately, this green Nile doesn't last long, it typically flows away in 3 or 4 days, serving only as a precursor to the true flood. The melting snows and excessive spring rains suddenly swell the torrents originating in the central plateau of Abyssinia. The Blue Nile, into which they flow, rolls so impetuously towards the plain that when its waters reach Khartoum in mid-May, they refuse to mix with the White Nile. Its peculiar color persists until it reaches Abu Hamd, 300 miles downstream. From that point, the Nile's height increases rapidly day by day. Constantly reinforced by successive floods from the Great Lakes and Abyssinia, the river rises with furious bounds. It would become a devastating torrent if its rage were not checked by the Nubian cataracts. Here, 6 basins, one above another, collect the water, slowing its course and allowing it to flow onward as a partially filtered and moderated stream. It is signaled at Syene around June 8, and at Cairo between the 17th and 20th, where its arrival is officially celebrated during the Night of the Drop. 2 days later, it reaches the delta, just in time to save the country from drought and sterility. Egypt, scorched by the Khamsin, a west wind blowing continuously for 50 days, seems nothing more than an extension of the desert. Trees are covered and choked by a layer of gray dust. Around the villages, meager, laboriously watered vegetable patches struggle for life, while some green lingers along canals and in hollows where moisture has not yet fully evaporated. The plain lies panting in the sun, naked, dusty, and ashen, scored with intersecting cracks as far as the eye can see. The Nile is only half its usual width, holding no more than a 20th of the water volume it carries in October. It initially struggles to reclaim its former bed, doing so with such subtle gradations that the rise is barely noticeable. However, it continually gains ground. Here a sandbank is covered, there an empty channel is filled, islets emerge where there was a continuous beach, and a new stream detaches itself to reach the old shore. The initial contact is disastrous for the banks. Their steep sides, disintegrated and cracked by the heat, offer no resistance to the current and fall with a crash, in lengths of 100 yards or more. As successive floods grow stronger and become more heavily charged with mud, the entire body of water turns turbid and changes color. In 8 or 10 days, it transforms from grayish-blue to dark red, occasionally so intense it resembles newly shed blood. The Red Nile is not unwholesome like the Green Nile, and the suspended mud that gives it its suspicious appearance does not diminish its freshness and lightness. It reaches its full height around July 15, but the dikes confining it and the barriers across canal mouths still prevent it from overflowing. The Nile must be deemed high enough to adequately submerge the land before it is released. Ancient Egyptians measured its height in cubits of 21¼ inches. At 14 cubits, they declared it an excellent Nile. Below 13 or above 15, it was deemed insufficient or excessive, both situations portending famine and perhaps pestilence. To this day, natives watch its advance with the same anxious eagerness. From July 3, public criers walk the streets of Cairo, announcing its progress each morning since evening. More or less authentic traditions claim that in the time of the pharaohs, the prelude to opening the canals was the solemn casting of a young girl, adorned as a bride, the Bride of the Nile, into the waters. Even after the Arab conquest, the river's eruption into the land was still seen as an actual marriage. The contract was drawn up by a Qadi, and witnesses confirmed its consummation with the most elaborate Oriental ceremonial. Generally, between July 1 and 16, the decision is made to break through the dikes. Once this has been solemnly accomplished, the flood still takes several days to fill the canals, then spreads gradually over the lowlands, advancing to the very edge of the desert. Egypt then becomes a sheet of turbid water, spread between 2 lines of rock and sand, flecked with green and black spots where towns stand or where the ground rises, and divided into irregular compartments by raised roads connecting the villages. In Nubia, the river reaches its greatest height towards the end of August. In Cairo and the Delta, this occurs 3 weeks to a month later. For about 8 days, it remains stationary, then begins to fall imperceptibly. Sometimes, a new freshet occurs in October, and the river rises again. But this rise is unsustained, it falls as rapidly as it rose, and by December, the river has completely retreated to its bed. One after another, the streams that fed it fail or dwindle. The Tacaz is lost among the sands before rejoining it, and the Blue Nile, almost deprived of tributaries, is only scantily maintained by Abyssinian snows. The White Nile owes the greater persistence of its waters to the Great Lakes, feeding the river as far as the Mediterranean and saving the valley from utter drought in winter. But even with this resource, the water level falls daily, and its volume diminishes. Long-hidden sandbanks reappear and link together again. Islands expand with the rise of shingly beaches, which gradually reconnect them with each other and with the shore. Smaller branches of the river cease to flow, forming a mere network of stagnant pools and muddy ponds that quickly dry up. The main channel itself is only intermittently navigable. After March, boats run aground and are forced to await the next inundation for release. From mid-April to mid-June, Egypt is only half alive, awaiting the new Nile. These ruddy and heavily charged waters, rising and retreating with almost mathematical regularity, bring and deposit the spoils of the countries they have traversed: sand from Nubia, whitish clay from the lake regions, ferruginous mud, and various rock formations from Abyssinia. These materials are not uniformly distributed in the deposits. Their precipitation is regulated by both their specific gravity and the current's velocity. Flattened stones and rounded pebbles are left behind at the cataract between Syene and Kenna. Coarser sand particles are suspended in the undercurrents, serving to raise the riverbed or carried out to sea, forming sandbanks slowly rising at the Damietta and Rosetta mouths of the Nile. The mud and finer particles rise towards the surface and are deposited upon the land after the dikes are opened. Soil that relies entirely on river deposits and is periodically flooded necessarily maintains a sparse flora. Although it is generally known that flora is richer closer to the equator, Egypt presents an exception to this rule. It has no more than 1,000 species, while an equally sized area like England, for instance, possesses over 1,500. Of these 1,000, most are not indigenous. Many have been brought from Central Africa by the river, with birds and winds continuing the work, and humans contributing to its completion. From Asia, wheat, barley, the olive, the apple, the white or pink almond, and about 20 other species now acclimatized on the Nile banks have been introduced at different times. Marsh plants dominate in the delta, but the papyrus and the 3 varieties of blue, white, and pink lotus that once flourished there are no longer cultivated and have almost entirely disappeared, reverting to their original habitats. The sycamore and date palm, both imports from Central Africa, have better adapted to their new home and are now fully naturalized in Egyptian soil. The sycamore grows as vigorously in the sand at the edge of the desert as it does in well-watered regions. Its roots delve deep in search of water, which infiltrates as far as the gorges of the hills, absorbing it freely even where drought seems absolute. The heavy, squat, gnarled trunk occasionally reaches colossal dimensions without ever growing very tall. Its rounded masses of compact foliage are so widespreading that a single tree in the distance can appear as several grouped together, and its shade is dense and impenetrable to the sun. A striking contrast to the sycamore is presented by the date palm. Its round and slender stem rises uninterruptedly to a height of 13 to 16 yards. Its head is crowned with a cluster of flexible leaves arranged in 2 or 3 tiers, but these are so sparse and so ruthlessly slit that they fail to block the light, casting only a slight and unrefreshing shadow. Few trees have such an elegant appearance, yet few are so monotonously elegant. Palm trees are seen everywhere, isolated, clustered by 2s and 3s at ravine mouths and around villages, planted in regular files along the riverbanks like rows of columns, symmetrically arranged in plantations. These form the invariable background against which other trees are grouped, diversifying the landscape. The feathery tamarisk and the nabk, the morina, the carob or locust tree, several varieties of acacia and mimosa, the sant, the mimosa habas, the white acacia, the acacia farnesiana, and the pomegranate tree all increase in number further from the Mediterranean. The dry air of the valley suits them marvelously but makes the tissue of their foliage hard and fibrous, giving them an airy aspect and faded tints unknown to their growth in other climates. Most of these trees do not reproduce spontaneously and tend to disappear when neglected. The acacia sail, once abundant along the riverbanks, is now almost entirely confined to certain valleys of the Theban desert, alongside a variety of the kernel dam palm, of which a poetical description has come down to us from the ancient Egyptians. The common dam palm bifurcates at 8 or 10 yards from the ground. These branches then subdivide, terminating in bunches of 20 to 30 palmate and fibrous leaves, 6 to 8 feet long. At the beginning of this century, the tree was common in Upper Egypt, but it is now becoming scarce, and we are within measurable distance of the time when its presence will be an exception north of the First Cataract. Willows are decreasing in number, and the persea, one of ancient Egypt's sacred trees, is now only found in gardens. None of the remaining tree species are common enough to grow in large clusters, and Egypt, reduced to its lofty groves of date palms, presents the singular spectacle of a country where there is no lack of trees, but an almost complete absence of shade. If Egypt is a land of imported flora, it is also a land of imported fauna, and all its animal species have been brought from neighboring countries. Some of these, such as the horse and the camel, were only introduced relatively recently, 2000 to 1800 years before our era, with the camel arriving even later. Animals like the long and short-horned oxen, along with varieties of goats and dogs, are, like the plants, generally of African origin. The Egyptian ass preserves an original purity of form and a vigor to which the European donkey has long been a stranger. The pig and the wild boar, the long-eared hare, the hedgehog, the ichneumon, the mouflon or maned sheep, innumerable gazelles, including the Egyptian gazelles, and antelopes with lyre-shaped horns, are as much West Asian as African. The same is true for the carnivores of all sizes, whose prey they are, the wild cat, the wolf, the jackal, the striped and spotted hyenas, the leopard, the panther, the hunting leopard, and the lion. On the other hand, most serpents, large and small, are indigenous. Some are harmless, like the colubers. Others are venomous, such as the saw-scaled viper, the horned viper, the Egyptian cobra, and the asp. The asp was worshipped by the Egyptians under the name of Uraeus. It occasionally reaches a length of 6.5 feet, and when approached, it will erect its head and inflate its throat, ready to strike. Its bite is fatal, like that of the horned viper. Birds are literally struck down by the strength of the poison, while large mammals and humans almost invariably succumb to it after a longer or shorter death struggle. The Uraeus is rarely found except in the desert or in fields. The scorpion crawls everywhere, in desert and city alike, and if its sting is not always fatal, it invariably causes terrible pain. Probably, there were once several kinds of gigantic serpents in Egypt, analogous to the pythons of equatorial Africa. They are still seen in representations of funerary scenes but nowhere else, for, like the elephant, the giraffe, and other animals now thriving only far south, they had disappeared by the beginning of historic times. The hippopotamus held its ground for a long time before returning to the equatorial regions from which it had been brought by the Nile. Common under the first dynasties, but later withdrawing to the delta marshes, it continued to flourish until the 13th century of our era. The crocodile, which arrived with it, has also been forced to retreat. Lord of the river throughout ancient times, worshipped and protected in some provinces, executed and proscribed in others, it could still be seen near Cairo at the beginning of this century. By 1840, it no longer passed beyond Gebel-e nor beyond Manfalut. 30 years later, Marriott asserted that it was steadily retreating before the guns of tourists and the disturbance caused by the regular passing of steamboats in the deep waters. Today, no one knows of a single crocodile existing below Aswan, but it continues to infest Nubia and the rocks of the First Cataract. One is occasionally carried down by the current into Egypt, where it is quickly dispatched by the fellahin or by some adventurer. The fertility of the soil and the vastness of the lakes and marshes attract many migratory birds. Passerines and web-footed birds flock there from all parts of the Mediterranean. Our European swallows, quails, geese, wild ducks, and herons, to mention only the most familiar, come here to winter, sheltered from cold and inclement weather. Even the non-migratory birds are, for the most part, strangers acclimatized by long residence. Some of them, the turtle-dove, the magpie, the kingfisher, the partridge, and the sparrow, may be classified with our European species, while others betray their equatorial origin in the brightness of their colors. White and black ibises, red flamingos, pelicans, and cormorants enliven the river's waters and animate the reedy swamps of the delta in infinite variety. They can be seen ranged in long files on the sandbanks, fishing and basking in the sun. Suddenly, the flock is seized with panic, rises heavily, and settles further away. In hollows of the hills, eagles and falcons, merlins, bald-headed vultures, kestrels, and golden sparrowhawks find inaccessible retreats, from which they descend upon the plains like so many plundering and well-armed barons. 1,000 little chattering birds come at eventide to perch in flocks upon the frail boughs of tamarisk and acacia. Many sea fish make their way upstream to swim in fresh waters, shad, mullet, perch, and labris, and extend their excursions far into the Said. Those species not originally Mediterranean still come annually from the heart of Ethiopia with the Nile, including 2 kinds of alashtes, the Nile turtle, the Bagris dakmak, and the mormoris. Some attain a gigantic size, the Bagris biad and the turtle to about 1 yard, the lates perch to 3.5 yards in length, while others, such as the catfish, are noted for their electric properties. Nature seems to have made the fahaka, or globefish, in a fit of playfulness. It is a long fish from beyond the cataracts, and it is carried by the Nile more easily due to its ability to fill itself with air and inflate its body at will. When excessively swelled out, the fahaka overbalances and drifts along upside down, its belly to the wind, covered with spikes so that it resembles a hedgehog. During the inundation, it floats with the current from one canal to another and is cast by the retreating waters upon the muddy fields, where it becomes prey for birds or jackals, or serves as a plaything for children. Everything depends on the river, the soil's produce, the animal species it sustains, the birds it feeds. Hence, the Egyptians placed the river among their gods. They personified it as a man with regular features and a vigorous, portly body, befitting those of high lineage and wealth. His breasts, fully developed like a woman's, though less firm, hang heavily upon a wide bosom where fat lies in folds. A narrow girdle, whose ends fall freely about the thighs, supports his spacious abdomen. His attire is completed by sandals and a close-fitting headdress, generally surmounted with a crown of water plants. Sometimes water springs from his breast, sometimes he presents a frog or libation vases, or holds a bundle of crucis ansatae as symbols of life, or bears a flat tray full of offerings, bunches of flowers, ears of corn, heaps of fish, and geese tied together by the feet. The inscriptions call him, Happy, Father of the Gods, Lord of Sustenance, who makes food to be, and covers the 2 lands of Egypt with his products, who gives life, banishes want, and fills the granaries to overflowing. He evolved into 2 personages, one sometimes colored red and the other blue. The former, who wears a cluster of lotus flowers upon his head, presides over southern Egypt, the latter has a bunch of papyrus for his headdress and watches over the delta. 2 goddesses, Mirit Kaimate for Upper Egypt and Mirit Mihit for Lower Egypt, personified the banks of the Nile, corresponding to its 2 main branches. They are often depicted with outstretched arms, as if pleading for the water that would make their land fertile. The Nile god had his own chapel in every province, served by priests whose duty it was to bury all human or animal bodies cast up by the river. For the god, they believed, had claimed these bodies, and to his servants they belonged. Several towns were dedicated to him, Hathapai, Nut-Hapi, and Nilopolis. In the Thebaid region, it was said that the god dwelled within a grotto or shrine, called a top hit, on the island of Biga. From this retreat, he was believed to emerge at the time of the inundation. This tradition dates from an era when the cataract was considered the end of the world, bringing the heavenly river down to earth. 2 gaping gulfs, or corridi, at the foot of 2 granite cliffs, or monetai, provided access to this mysterious sanctuary. A bas-relief from Philae depicts blocks of stone piled high, with the vulture of the south and the hawk of the north perched on each summit, both wearing panther skins and raising their arms in adoration. The statue itself is damaged, the end of the nose, the beard, and part of the tray are missing, but are restored in the illustration. 2 small birds hang alongside geese, next to a bunch of ears of corn. These are fat quails, and the circular chamber shows Happy crouching, clutching a libation vase in each hand. A single coil of a serpent outlines this chamber, leaving a narrow passage between its overlapping head and tail. Through this passage, the rising waters would overflow at the appointed time, bringing to Egypt all things good, and sweet, and pure, which nourished both gods and men. Towards the summer solstice, precisely when the sacred water from the gulfs of Syene reached Silsile, the local priests, sometimes even the reigning sovereign or one of his sons, would sacrifice a bull and geese. Then, a sealed papyrus scroll would be cast into the waters. This scroll contained a written order to ensure a normal inundation for Egypt. When Pharaoh himself officiated, a stela engraved on the rocks would preserve the memory of the event. Even in his absence, the festivals of the Nile were among the most solemn and joyous in the land. According to a tradition passed down through generations, the prosperity or adversity of the year depended on the splendor and fervor with which these celebrations were held. Had the faithful shown the slightest lukewarmness, the Nile might have refused to obey the command and failed to spread freely across the country. Peasants from distant areas, each bringing their own provisions, would share meals for days, living in a state of revelry as long as this kind of fare lasted. On the great day itself, the priests would emerge in procession from the sanctuary, carrying the statue of the god along the banks, to the sound of instruments and the chanting of hymns. 1. Hail to thee, happy, who appears in the land and comes, to give life to Egypt, thou who hides thy coming in darkness, on this very day whereon thy coming is sung, wave, which spreads over the orchards created by Ra, to give life to all those who are thirsty, who refuses to give drink to the desert, of the overflow of the waters of heaven. As soon as thou descends, Sibu, the earth god, is enamored of bread, Napri, the god of grain, presents his offering, Ta makes every workshop to prosper. 2. Lord of the fish. As soon as he passes the cataract, the birds no longer descend upon the fields, creator of corn, maker of barley, he prolongs the existence of temples. Do his fingers cease from their labors, or does he suffer? Then are all the millions of beings in misery, does he wane in heaven? Then the gods, themselves, and all men perish. 3. The cattle are driven mad, and all the world, both great and small, are in torment, but if, on the contrary, the prayers of men are heard at his rising, and for them he makes himself Knumu, when he arises, then the earth shouts for joy, then are all bellies joyful, each back is shaken with laughter, and every tooth grinds. 4. Bringing food, rich in sustenance, creator of all good things, lord of all seeds of life, pleasant unto his elect, if his friendship is secured, he produces fodder for the cattle, and he provides for the sacrifices of all the gods, finer than any other is the incense which comes from him, he takes possession of the two lands, and the granaries are filled, the storehouses are prosperous, and the goods of the poor are multiplied. 5. He is at the service of all prayers to answer them, withholding nothing. To make boats to be, that is his strength. Stones are not sculpted for him, nor statues whereon the double crown is placed, he is unseen, no tribute is paid unto him and no offerings are brought unto him, he is not charmed by words of mystery, the place of his dwelling is unknown, nor can his shrine be found by virtue of magic writings. 6. There is no house large enough for thee, nor any who may penetrate within thy heart, nevertheless, the generations of thy children rejoice in thee, for thou dost rule as a king, whose decrees are established for the whole earth, who is manifest in presence of the people of the south and of the north, by whom the tears are washed from every eye, and who is lavish of his bounties. 7. Where sorrow was, there does break forth joy, and every heart rejoices. Savku, the crocodile, the child of Nit, leaps for gladness, for the 9 gods who accompany thee have ordered all things, the overflow gives drink unto the fields, and makes all men valiant, one man takes to drink of the labor of another, without charge being brought against him. 8. If thou dost enter in the midst of songs to go forth in the midst of gladness, if they dance with joy when thou comest forth out of the unknown, it is that thy heaviness is death and corruption. And when thou art implored to give the water of the year, the people of the Thebaid and of the north are seen side by side, each man with the tools of his trade, none tarries behind his neighbor, of all those who clothe themselves, no man clothes himself with festive garments, the children of Thought, the god of riches, no longer adorn themselves with jewels, nor the 9 gods, but they are in the night, as soon as thou hast answered by the rising, each one anoints himself with perfumes. 9. Establisher of true riches, desire of men, here are seductive words in order that thou mayest reply, if thou dost answer mankind by waves of the heavenly ocean, Napri, the grain god, presents his offering, all the gods adore thee, the birds no longer descend upon the hills, though that which thy hand forms were of gold, or in the shape of a brick of silver, it is not lapis lazuli that we eat, but wheat is of more worth than precious stones. 10. They have begun to sing unto thee upon the harp, they sing unto thee keeping time with their hands, and the generations of thy children rejoice in thee, and they have filled thee with salutations of praise, for it is the God of riches who adorns the earth, who makes barks to prosper in the sight of man, who rejoices the heart of women with child, who loves the increase of the flocks. 11. When thou art risen in the city of the prince, then is the rich man filled, the small man, the poor, disdains the lotus, all is solid and of good quality, all herbage is for his children, but does he forget to give food? Prosperity forsakes the dwellings, and earth falls into a wasting sickness. The word Nile is of uncertain origin. We inherited it from the Greeks, who in turn adopted it from a non-Egyptian people, perhaps the Phoenicians, the Kheti, the Libyans, or people from Asia Minor. When the Egyptians themselves did not refer to their river as the god Hapi, they called it the sea or the Great River. They had 20 or more terms to describe its different phases throughout the seasons, but they would not have understood what was meant if one spoke to them of the Nile. The name Egypt is also part of the Hellenic tradition. Perhaps it was derived from the temple name of Memphis, Haikufta, a name that Mediterranean barbarian coast tribes must have heard ringing in their ears as that of the most important and wealthiest town on their sea. The Egyptians called themselves Bamatu or Botu, and their country Kemet, the Black Land. Where did they come from? How far back in time should we place their arrival? The oldest known monuments transport us back no further than 6,000 years, yet they display such refined art, so well defined in its main outlines, and reveal such an ingeniously combined system of administration, government, and religion, that we infer a long past of accumulated centuries preceding them. It remains difficult to precisely estimate the time required for a race as gifted as the ancient Egyptians to evolve from barbarism to a high degree of culture. Nevertheless, I believe we would not be mistaken in allowing them 40 or 50 centuries to achieve such complex accomplishments, placing their first appearance at 8 to 10,000 years before our era. Their earliest known world was very limited. Their gaze might wander westward over the ravine-furrowed plains of the Libyan desert without reaching the fabled land of Manu, where the sun set every evening. But looking eastward from the valley, they could see the peak of Baku, which marked the limit of regions accessible to humankind. Beyond these regions lay the beginnings of Tanutri, the land of the gods, and the breezes passing over it were laden with its perfumes, sometimes wafting them to mortals lost in the desert. Northward, the world ended towards the lagoons of the delta, whose inaccessible islands were believed to be the dwelling place of souls after death. As for the south, precise knowledge scarcely extended beyond the defile of Gebel Silsili, where the last remains of the granite threshold had perhaps not entirely disappeared. The district beyond Gebel Silsili, the province of Kunussit, was still a foreign and almost mythical country, directly connected with heaven by means of the cataract. Long after the Egyptians had ventured beyond this restricted circle, the names of these places, which had marked their frontiers, continued to be associated in their minds with the idea of the four cardinal points. Baku and Manu were still the most frequent expressions for the extreme east and west. Nekabit and Buto, the most populous towns near Gebel Silsili and the Delta Ponds, were set against each other to designate south and north. It was within these narrow limits that Egyptian civilization took root and ripened, as if in a closed vessel. Who were the people who developed it, where did they come from, and to which races did they belong? Today, this is unknown. The majority would place their homeland in Asia, but cannot agree on the route they took for their emigration to Africa. Some believe the people took the shortest route across the Isthmus of Suez. Others suggest longer journeys and a more complicated itinerary, having them cross the Straits of Bab el-Mandeb, then the Abyssinian Mountains, and spreading northward along the Nile to finally settle in present-day Egypt. However, a closer examination compels us to recognize that the hypothesis of an Asiatic origin, though attractive, is somewhat difficult to maintain. The bulk of the Egyptian population exhibits the characteristics of those races found established from antiquity on the Mediterranean slope of the Libyan continent. This population is of African origin, and came to Egypt from the west or southwest. In the valley, perhaps, it may have encountered a black race, which it drove back or destroyed. And there, perhaps, it later received an influx of Asiatic elements, introduced by way of the isthmus and the delta marshes. But whatever the origin of the Egyptians' ancestors, they had barely settled on the banks of the Nile before the country conquered and assimilated them, as it has continued to do with all foreigners who have occupied it. By the time their history begins for us, all inhabitants had long formed a single people with a single language. This language appears to be connected to Semitic tongues through many of its roots. It forms its personal pronouns, both isolated and suffixed, in a similar way. One of the tenses of verb conjugation, the simplest and most archaic, is formed with identical affixes. Without dwelling on resemblances that are open to doubt, it can almost be affirmed that most of the grammatical processes used in Semitic languages are found in a rudimentary condition in Egyptian. One might say that the language of the Egyptian people and the languages of the Semitic races, having once belonged to the same group, separated very early, at a time when the vocabulary and grammatical system of the group had not yet taken definite shape. Subject to different influences, the two families would treat their common elements in diverse ways. The Semitic dialects continued to develop for centuries, while the Egyptian language, though cultivated earlier, stopped short in its growth. If it is obvious that there was an original connection between the language of Egypt and that of Asia, the text states, this connection is nevertheless sufficiently remote to leave to the Egyptian race a distinct physiognomy. We recognize this distinct physiognomy in sculptured and painted portraits, as well as in thousands of mummified bodies from subterranean tombs. The highest type of Egyptian was tall and slender, with a proud and imperious air in the carriage of his head and his entire bearing. He had wide and full shoulders, well-defined and vigorous pectoral muscles, muscular arms, long, fine hands, slightly developed hips, and sinewy legs. The detail of the knee joint and the calf muscles are strongly marked beneath the skin. The long, thin, and low-arched feet are flattened at the extremities due to the custom of going barefoot. The head is rather short, the face oval, the forehead somewhat receding. The eyes are wide and fully opened, the cheekbones not too prominent, the nose fairly prominent and either straight or aquiline. The mouth is long, the lips full and lightly ridged along their outline. The teeth are small, even, well set, and remarkably sound. The ears are set high on the head. At birth, the skin is white, but darkens in proportion to sun exposure. Men are generally painted red in pictures, though, in reality, there must have been all the shades we see among the present population, from a delicate, rose-tinted complexion to that of a smoke-colored bronze. Women, who were less exposed to the sun, are generally painted yellow, the tint paler as they rise in social status. The hair tended to be wavy, and even to curl into small ringlets, but without ever turning into the wool of the Negro. The beard was scanty, thick only on the chin. Such was the highest type. The commoner was squat, dumpy, and heavy. Chest and shoulders seem enlarged at the expense of the pelvis and hips, to such an extent as to make the lack of proportion between the upper and lower body startling and ungraceful. The skull is long, somewhat receding, and slightly flattened on top. The features are coarse, as if carved in flesh with broad strokes of a blocking-out chisel. Small, restless eyes, a short nose flanked by widely distended nostrils, round cheeks, a square chin, thick but not curling lips, this unattractive and somewhat comical physiognomy, sometimes animated by an expression of cunning reminiscent of an old French peasant, is often brightened by gleams of gentleness and melancholy good nature. The external characteristics of these two principal types, with all their modifications, can still be seen among the living population today. A profile copied from a randomly chosen Theban mummy from an 18th dynasty necropolis, compared with the likeness of a modern Luxor peasant, would almost pass for a family portrait. Wandering Bisharin has inherited the facial type of a great noble, a contemporary of Keeps. Any peasant woman of the Delta might bear on her shoulders the head of a 12th dynasty king. A citizen of Cairo, gazing in wonder at the statues of Khafra or Seti I in the Gizeh Museum, is himself, feature for feature, the very image of those ancient pharaohs, though separated from them by 50 centuries. Until quite recently, little or nothing had been discovered that could be attributed to the primitive races of Egypt. Even the flint weapons and implements found in various places could not be ascribed to them with certainty, because the Egyptians continued to use stone long after they knew about metal. They made stone arrowheads, hammers, and knives not only during the time of the pharaohs, but under the Romans, and throughout the Middle Ages, and their manufacture has not yet entirely died out. These objects, and the workshops where they were made, might therefore be less ancient than most of the inscribed monuments. But even if we had found no examples of work from the earliest ages, we encountered certain customs in historic times that were out of harmony with the general civilization of the period. A comparison of these customs with similar practices of barbarous nations shed light on the former, completed their meaning, and showed us the successive stages through which the Egyptian people had to pass before reaching their highest civilization. For example, We know that as late as the Roman Caesars, girls from noble families at Thebes were consecrated to the service of Ammon, thus licensed to a life of immorality. This, however, did not prevent them from making rich marriages when age compelled them to retire from office. Theban women were not the only people in the world to whom such a license was granted or imposed by law. Wherever in a civilized country we see a similar practice, we can recognize in it an ancient custom that, over centuries, degenerated into a religious observance. The institution of the women of Ammon is a legacy from a time when polyandry was practiced, and marriage, as we know it, did not yet exist. Age and maternity relieved them from this obligation, and preserved them from the incestuous connections for which we find examples in other races. A union of father and daughter, however, was perhaps not entirely forbidden, and that of brother and sister seems to have been regarded as perfectly right and natural. In Egyptian love songs, the words brother and sister held the same significance as lover and mistress for us. Paternity was necessarily doubtful in such a community, and thus the tie between fathers and children was slight. There was no family, in the sense we understand the word, except as it centered around the mother. Maternal descent was, therefore, the only one openly acknowledged, and the child's affiliation was indicated by the mother's name alone. When a woman ceased to belong to all and confined herself to one husband, the man reserved the privilege of taking as many wives as he wished, or could support, beginning with his own sisters. Not all wives enjoyed identical rights. Those born of the same parents as the man, or those of equal rank with him, preserved their independence. If the law declared him the master, Nebu, to whom they owed obedience and fidelity, they were also mistresses of the house, Nibit Piru, as well as wives, Himatu, and these two words of the title express their condition. Each of them, in fact, occupied her own house, Piru, which she had from her parents or her husband, and of which she was absolute mistress, Nibit. She lived in it and performed all a woman's duties without constraint, feeding the fire, grinding corn, cooking and weaving, making clothing and perfumes, nursing and teaching her children. When her husband visited her, he was a guest whom she received on an equal footing. It appears that at the outset, these various wives were placed under the authority of an older woman, whom they regarded as their mother, and who defended their rights and interests against the master. But this custom gradually disappeared, and in historic times, we read of it as existing only in the families of the gods. The female singers consecrated to Ammon and other deities owed obedience to several superiors, the principal of whom, generally the widow of a king or high priest, was called the chief superior of the ladies of the harem of Ammon. Besides these wives, there were concubines, slaves purchased or born in the house, prisoners of war, or Egyptians of inferior class. These were the chattels of the man, and he could dispose of them as he wished. All the children of one father were legitimate, whether their mother was a wife or merely a concubine, but they did not all enjoy the same advantages. Those among them born of a brother and sister united in legitimate marriage took precedence over those whose mother was a wife of inferior rank or a slave. In the family thus constituted, the woman, to all appearances, played the principal part. Children recognized the parental relationship solely through the mother. The husband appears to have entered the house of his wives, rather than the wives entering his, and this appearance of inferiority was so marked that the Greeks were deceived by it. They affirmed that the woman was supreme in Egypt. At the time of marriage, the man promised obedience to her and entered into a contract not to raise any objection to her commands. We, therefore, had good grounds for supposing that the first Egyptians were semi-savages, like those still living in Africa and America, having a similar organization and similar weapons and tools. A few lived in the desert, in the oasis of Libya, or in the deep valleys of the Red Land, Dashret to Dashru, between the Nile and the sea. The poverty of the country fostered their native savagery. Others, settled on the Black Land, gradually became civilized, and we have recently found considerable remains of those generations who, if not earlier than the times of written records, were at least contemporary with the earliest kings of the first historical dynasty. Their houses were like those of the fellahs of today, low huts of wattle daubed with puddled clay, or of bricks dried in the sun. They contained one room either oblong or square, with the door as the only opening. Only the houses of the richer class were large enough to require supporting the roof with one or more tree trunks, which served as columns. Earthen pots, turned by hand, flint knives and other implements, mats of reeds or plaited straw, 2 flat stones for grinding corn, a few pieces of wooden furniture, stools, and headrests for use at night, comprised all their possessions. Their ordinary pottery is heavy and almost devoid of ornament, but some of the finer kinds were molded and baked in wickerwork baskets, which left a quaint, trellis-like impression on the clay's surface. In many cases, the vases are bicolored, the body being a fine smooth red, polished with a stone, while the neck and base are an intense black, with a surface even more shining than the red part. Sometimes they are ornamented with white patterns of flowers, palms, ostriches, gazelles, boats with undulated or broken lines, or very simple geometrical figures. More often, the ground is a fine yellow, and the decoration has been traced in red lines. Jars, saucers, double vases, flat plates, large cups, supports for amphorae, trays raised on a foot, in short, every kind of form was found in use at that remote period. The men went about nearly naked, except for nobles, who wore a panther's skin, sometimes thrown over the shoulders, sometimes drawn around the waist, covering the lower part of the body, with the animal's tail touching the heels behind, as we see later in several representations of the Upper Nile Negroes. They smeared their limbs with grease or oil, and they tattooed their faces and bodies, at least in part. But in later times, this practice was retained by the lower classes only. On the other hand, the custom of painting the face was never abandoned. To complete their toilet, it was necessary to accentuate the arch of the eyebrow with a line of kohl, an antimony powder. A similar black line surrounded and prolonged the oval of the eye to the middle of the temple, a layer of green colored the underlid, and ochre and carmine enlivened the tints of the cheeks and lips. The hair, plaited, curled, oiled, and plastered with grease, formed an elaborate coiffure that was as complicated for men as for women. Should the hair be too short, a black or blue wig, skillfully dressed, was substituted for it. Ostrich feathers waved on the heads of warriors, and a large lock, flattened behind the right ear, distinguished military or religious chiefs from their subordinates. When the art of weaving became common, a belt and loincloth of white linen replaced the leather garment. Fastened around the waist, but so low as to leave the navel uncovered, the loincloth frequently reached to the knee. The hinder part was often drawn between the legs and attached in front to the belt, thus forming a kind of drawers. Animal tails and wild animal skins henceforth served only as insignia of authority with which priests and princes adorned themselves on great days and at religious ceremonies. The skin was sometimes carelessly thrown over the left shoulder and swayed with the movement of the body, sometimes it was carefully adjusted over one shoulder and under the other, so as to emphasize the curve of the chest. The animal's head, skillfully prepared and enlivened by large enamel eyes, rested on the shoulder or fell just below the wearer's waist. The paws, with claws attached, hung down over the thighs. The spots of the skin were manipulated to form 5-pointed stars. When going outdoors, a large wrap was thrown over everything. This covering was either smooth or hairy, similar to that in which the Nubians and Abyssinians of today envelop themselves. It could be draped in various ways, transversely over the left shoulder like the fringed shawl of the Chaldeans, or hanging straight from both shoulders like a mantle. In fact, it served as a cloak, sheltering the wearer from the sun or rain, from heat or cold. They never sought to transform it into a luxurious garment of state, as was the case later with the Roman toga, whose amplitude conferred a certain dignity of carriage and whose carefully adjusted folds fell around the body with studied grace. The Egyptian mantle, when not needed, was thrown aside and folded up. The material, being fine and soft, occupied little space and was reduced to a long thin roll. The ends were then fastened together, and it was slung over the shoulder and around the body like a cavalry cloak. Travelers, shepherds, all those whose occupations called them to the fields, carried it as a bundle at the ends of their sticks. Once they arrived at their work site, they deposited it in a corner with their provisions until they required it. At first, women were content with a loincloth like that of men. It was enlarged and lengthened until it reached the ankle below and the bosom above, becoming a tightly fitting garment with 2 bands over the shoulders, like braces, to keep it in place. The feet were not always covered. On certain occasions, however, sandals of coarse leather, plaited straw, split reed, or even painted wood, adorned those shapely Egyptian feet, which, to suit our taste, would ideally be a little shorter. Both men and women in ancient Egypt loved ornaments, covering their necks, breasts, arms, wrists, and ankles with many rows of necklaces and bracelets. Bracelets were crafted from elephant ivory, mother of pearl, or even cleverly perforated flint. Necklaces were made of strings of pierced shells, interspersed with seeds and small pebbles, either sparkling or unusually shaped. Later, terracotta imitations replaced natural shells, and precious stones were substituted for pebbles. Enamel beads, round, pear-shaped, or cylindrical, also became popular. To terminate the necklaces and maintain a uniform distance between bead rows, slips of wood, bone, ivory, porcelain, or terracotta were used, pierced with holes through which the threads ran. Weapons, at least among the nobility, were an indispensable part of their attire. Most were designed for hand-to-hand combat: sticks, clubs, lances tipped with sharpened bone or stone, flint axes and daggers, and various bone or wood sabers and clubs, pointed or rounded, with blunt or sharp blades. Though they may seem inoffensive to look at, when wielded by a strong hand, they were sufficient to break an arm, crush ribs, or precisely smash a skull. The plain or triple curved bow was the favored weapon for long-distance attack. In addition, there were the sling, the javelin, and a missile almost forgotten today, the boomerang. However, we have no proof that the Egyptians handled the boomerang with the skill of the Australians, or that they knew how to throw it so that it would return to its point of departure. Such was the approximate ancient equipment, as far as we can ascertain. But copper and iron were known in Egypt at a very early date. Long before historical times, most wooden weapons were replaced by those of metal, daggers, sabers, and hatchets, which nonetheless preserved the shape of the older wooden instruments. Those wooden weapons that were retained were used for hunting or brought out only on solemn occasions when tradition had to be respected. The war baton became the commander's wand of authority, eventually degenerating into the walking stick of the wealthy or noble. The club eventually represented merely the rank of a chieftain, while the crook and the wooden-handled mace, with its head of ivory, diorite, granite, or white stone, the favorite weapons of princes, continued to be the most revered insignia of royalty until the end. Life was lived in comparative ease and pleasure. Of the ponds left in the open country by the river after its fall, some dried up more or less quickly during the winter, leaving an immense quantity of fish on the soil, which birds and wild beasts disputed with humans. Other pools, however, remained until the returning inundation, acting as vivaria where fish were preserved for those living on the banks. Fishing with a harpoon, made of either stone or metal, with a line, net, or traps, were all methods known and used by Egyptians from early times. Where the ponds failed, the neighboring Nile furnished inexhaustible supplies. Standing in light canoes, or rather supported by a plank on bundles of reeds bound together, they ventured into midstream despite the danger from the ever-present hippopotamus. Or they penetrated up the canals amidst a thicket of aquatic plants to bring down birds with the boomerang that found cover there. Fowl and fish that could not be eaten fresh were dried, salted, or smoked and kept for a rainy day. Like the river, the desert had its perils and its resources. All too frequently, lions, leopards, panthers, and other large felines were encountered there. Nobles, like the pharaohs of later times, deemed it their privilege or duty to stalk and destroy these animals, pursuing them even to their dens. The common people preferred attacking gazelle, oryx, mouflon sheep, ibex, wild ox, and ostrich, but did not disdain more humble game such as the porcupine and long-eared hare. Nondescript packs, in which the jackal and hyena ran alongside the wolf dog and the lithe Abyssinian greyhound, scented and retrieved for their master the prey he had pierced with his arrows. At times, a hunter returning with the dead body of a mother would be followed by one of her young. Or a gazelle, only slightly wounded, would be taken to the village and healed of its hurt. Such animals, through daily contact with humans, were gradually tamed, forming a motley flock around their dwelling, kept partly for pleasure and mostly for profit, and becoming a ready stock of provisions in case of necessity. Efforts were therefore made to enlarge this flock, and the wish to procure animals without seriously injuring them caused the Egyptians to use nets for birds and the lasso and bola for quadrupeds, weapons less brutal than the arrow and the javelin. The bola was made by them of a single rounded stone, attached to a strap about 5 yards in length. Once the stone was thrown, the cord twisted around the legs, muzzle, or neck of the pursued animal. By the attachment thus made, the pursuer, using all his strength, was able to bring the beast down, half strangled. The lasso had no stone attached to it but a noose prepared beforehand, and the skill of the hunter consisted of throwing it around the neck of his victim while running. They caught indifferently, without distinction of size or kind, all that chance brought within their reach. The daily chase kept up these half-tamed flocks of gazelles, wild goats, waterbucks, storks, and ostriches, and their numbers are reckoned by hundreds on the monuments of the ancient empire. Experience alone taught the hunter to distinguish between species from which he could draw profit and others whose wildness made them impossible to domesticate. The subjection of the most useful kinds had not been finished when the historical period opened. The ass, sheep, and goat were already domesticated, but the pig was still out in the marshes in a semi-wild state, under the care of special herdsmen. Religious rites preserved the remembrance of times when the ox was so little tamed that, to capture animals needed for sacrifice or slaughter while grazing, it was necessary to use the lasso. Europeans are astonished to meet today whole peoples who use herbs and plants whose flavor and properties are nauseating to us. These are mostly legacies from a remote past. For example, castor oil, with which the Berbers rub their limbs and with which the fellahin of the Said flavor their bread and vegetables, was preferred above all others by the Egyptians of the Pharaonic age for anointing the body and for culinary use. They had begun by eating indiscriminately every kind of fruit the country produced. Many of these, once their therapeutic virtues were learned by experience, were gradually banished as articles of food, and their use restricted to medicine. Others fell into disuse and only reappeared at sacrifices or at funeral feasts. Several varieties continue to be eaten to the present time: the acid fruits of the nabika and the carob tree, the astringent figs of the sycamore, the insipid pulp of the dom palm, besides those pleasant to our Western palates, such as the common fig and the date. The vine flourished, at least in Middle and Lower Egypt. From time immemorial, the art of making wine from it was known, and even the most ancient monuments enumerate half a dozen famous brands, red or white. Vetches, lupins, beans, chickpeas, lentils, onions, fenugreek, bamia, moluccia, and arum colocasia all grew wild in the fields, and the river itself supplied its quota of nourishing plants. Two of the lotus species that grew in the Nile, the white and the blue, have seed vessels similar to those of the poppy. The capsules contain small grains the size of millet seed. The fruit of the pink lotus grows on a different stalk from that of the flower and springs directly from the root. It resembles a honeycomb in form, or, to use a more prosaic simile, the rose of a watering can. The upper part has 20 or 30 cavities, each containing a seed as big as an olive stone, and pleasant to eat either fresh or dried. This is what the ancients called the bean of Egypt. The yearly shoots of the papyrus are also gathered. After pulling them up in the marshes, the points are cut off and rejected, the part remaining being about a cubit in length. It is eaten as a delicacy and is sold in the markets, but those who are fastidious partake of it only after baking. 20 different kinds of grain and fruits, prepared by crushing between two stones, were kneaded and baked to furnish cakes or bread. These are often mentioned in the texts as nabika cakes, date cakes, and fig cakes. Lily loaves, made from the roots and seeds of the lotus, were the delight of the gourmand and appear on the tables of the kings of the 19th dynasty. Bread and cakes made of cereals formed the habitual food of the people. Durra is of African origin, it is the grain of the south of the inscriptions. On the other hand, it is supposed that wheat and six-roed barley came from the region of the Euphrates. Egypt was among the first to procure and cultivate them. The soil there is so kind to man that in many places no agricultural toil is required. As soon as the water of the Nile retires, the ground is sown without previous preparation, and the grain, falling straight into the mud, grows as vigorously as in the best plowed furrows. Where the earth is hard, it is necessary to break it up, but the extreme simplicity of the instruments with which this was done shows what feeble resistance it offered. For a long time, the hoe sufficed. It was composed either of a large stone tied to a wooden handle or was made of two pieces of wood of unequal length, united at one of their extremities and held together towards the middle by a slack cord. The plough, when first invented, was but a slightly enlarged hoe, drawn by oxen. The cultivation of cereals, once established on the banks of the Nile, developed from earliest times to such a degree as to supplant all else. Hunting, fishing, and the rearing of cattle occupied but a secondary place compared with agriculture, and Egypt became what she still remains, a vast granary of wheat. The part of the valley first cultivated was from Gebel Silsili to the apex of the delta. Between the Libyan and Arabian ranges, it presents a slightly convex surface, furrowed lengthwise by a depression, at the bottom of which the Nile is gathered and enclosed when the inundation is over. In the summer, as soon as the river had risen higher than the top of its banks, the water rushed by the force of gravity towards the lower lands, hollowing in its course long channels, some of which never completely dried up, even when the Nile reached its lowest level. Cultivation was easy in the neighborhood of these natural reservoirs, but everywhere else, the movements of the river were rather injurious than advantageous to man. The inundation scarcely ever covered the higher ground in the valley, which therefore remained unproductive. It flowed rapidly over the lands of medium elevation and moved so sluggishly in the hollows that they became weedy and stagnant pools. In any given year, the portion not watered by the river was invaded by sand. From the lush vegetation of a hot country, there was but one step to absolute aridity. At the present day, an ingeniously established system of irrigation allows the agriculturist to direct and distribute the overflow according to his needs. From Gebel Ain to the sea, the Nile and its principal branches are bordered by long dikes, which closely follow the windings of the river and furnish sufficiently stable embankments. Numerous canals lead off to the right and left, directed more or less obliquely towards the confines of the valley. They are divided at intervals by fresh dikes, starting on one side from the river and ending on the other either at the Bahr Yusuf or at the rising of the desert. Some of these dikes protect one district only and consist merely of a bank of earth. Others command a large extent of territory, and a breach in them would entail the ruin of an entire province. These latter are sometimes like real ramparts, made of crude brick carefully cemented. A few, as at Kosheish, have a core of hewn stones, which later generations have covered with masses of brickwork and strengthened with constantly renewed buttresses of earth. They wind across the plain with many unexpected and apparently aimless turns. On closer examination, however, it may be seen that this irregularity is not to be attributed to ignorance or caprice. Experience had taught the Egyptians the art of picking out, upon the almost imperceptible relief of the soil, the easiest lines to use against the inundation. Of these they have carefully followed the sinuosities, and if the course of the dikes appears singular, it is to be ascribed to the natural configuration of the ground. Subsidiary embankments thrown up between the principal ones and parallel to the Nile separate the higher ground bordering the river from the lowlands on the confines of the valley. They divide the larger basins into smaller divisions of varying area, in which the irrigation is regulated by means of special trenches. As long as the Nile is falling, the dwellers on its banks leave their canals in free communication with it. But they dam them up towards the end of the winter, just before the return of the inundation, and do not reopen them until early August, when the new flood is at its height. The waters then flowing in by the trenches are arrested by the nearest transverse dike and spread over the fields. When they have stood there long enough to saturate the ground, the dike is pierced, and they pour into the next basin until they are stopped by a second dike, which in its turn forces them again to spread out on either side. This operation is renewed from dike to dike, until the valley soon becomes a series of artificial ponds, ranging one above another, and flowing one into another from Gebel Silsili to the apex of the delta. In autumn, the mouth of each ditch is dammed up anew to prevent the mass of water from flowing back into the stream. The transverse dikes, which have been cut in various places, are also repaired, and the basins become completely landlocked, separated by narrow causeways. In some places, the water thus imprisoned is so shallow that it is soon absorbed by the soil. In others, it is so deep that after it has been kept in for several weeks, it is necessary to let it run off into a neighboring depression or straight into the river itself. History has left us no account of the vicissitudes of the struggle in which the Egyptians were engaged with the Nile, nor of the time expended in bringing it to a successful issue. Legend attributes the idea of the system and its partial working out to the god Osiris. Then, Menes, the first mortal king, is said to have made the dike of Kosheish, on which depended on the prosperity of the Delta and Middle Egypt. The fabulous Moeris is supposed to have extended the blessings of irrigation to the Fayum. In reality, the regulation of the inundation and the making of cultivable land are the work of unrecorded generations who populated the valley. The kings of the historic period had only to maintain and develop certain points of what had already been done, and Upper Egypt is to this day checkered by the network of waterways with which its earliest inhabitants covered it. The work must have begun simultaneously at several points, without previous agreement, and, as it were, instinctively. A dike protecting a village, a canal draining or watering some small province, demanded the efforts of but few individuals. Then the dikes would join one another, the canals would be prolonged until they met others, and the work undertaken by chance would be improved and would spread with the concurrence of an ever-increasing population. What happened at the end of the last century shows us that the system grew and was developed at the expense of considerable quarrels and bloodshed. The inhabitants of each district carried out the part of the work most conducive to their own interest, seizing the supply of water, keeping it, and discharging it at pleasure, without considering whether they were injuring their neighbors by depriving them of their supply or by flooding them. Hence arose perpetual strife and fighting. It became imperative that the rights of the weaker should be respected and that the system of distribution should be coordinated for the country to accept a beginning at least of social organization analogous to that which it acquired later. The Nile thus determined the political as well as the physical constitution of Egypt. The country was divided among communities, whose members were supposed to be descended from the same seed, or pate, and to belong to the same family, or paitu. The chiefs of them were called ropetu, the guardians, or pastors of the family, and in later times their name became a title applicable to the nobility in general. Families combined and formed groups of various importance under the authority of a head chief, ropetuha. They were, in fact, hereditary lords, dispensing justice, levying taxes in kind on their subordinates, reserving to themselves the redistribution of land, leading their men to battle, and sacrificing to the gods. The territories over which they exercised authority formed small states, whose boundaries even now, in some places, can be pointed out with certainty. The principality of the Terebinth occupied the very heart of Egypt, where the valley is widest and the course of the Nile most advantageously disposed of by nature, a country well suited to be the cradle of an infant civilization. Sayet, the capital, is built almost at the foot of the Libyan range, on a strip of land barely a mile in width, which separates the river from the hills. A canal surrounds it on three sides and makes, as it were, a natural ditch about its walls. During the inundation, it is connected with the mainland only by narrow causeways, shaded with mimosas, and looking like a raft of verdure aground in the current. The sight is as happy as it is picturesque. Not only does the town command the two arms of the river, opening or closing the waterway at will, but from time immemorial, the most frequented of the routes into Central Africa has terminated at its gates, bringing to it the commerce of the Sudan. It held sway, at the outset, over both banks, from range to range, northward as far as Dirut, where the true Bahr Yusuf leaves the Nile, and southward to the neighborhood of Gebel Sheikh Haridi. The extent and original number of the other principalities is not so easily determined. The most important, to the north of Sayet, were those of the Hare and the Oleander. The principality of the Hare never reached the dimensions of that of its neighbor the Terebinth, but its chief town was Khmunu, whose antiquity was so remote that a universally accepted tradition made it the scene of the most important acts of creation. That of the Oleander, on the contrary, was even larger than that of the Terebinth, and from Hininsu, its chief governor ruled alike over the marshes of the Fayum and the plains of Beni Suef. To the south, Apu on the right bank governed a district so closely shut in between a bend of the Nile and two spurs of the range, that its limits have never varied much since ancient times. Its inhabitants were divided in their employment between weaving and the culture of cereals. From early times, they possessed the privilege of furnishing clothing to a large part of Egypt, and their looms, at the present day, still make those checked or striped malayas, which the fellow women wear over their long blue tunics. Beyond Apu, Thynis, the Gurge of the Arabs, situated on both banks of the river, rivaled Khmunu in antiquity and Sayet in wealth. Its plains still produce the richest harvests and feed the most numerous herds of sheep and oxen in the said. As we approach the cataract, information becomes scarcer. Kubti and Anu of the south, the Coptos and Hermonthis of the Greeks, shared peaceably the plain occupied later on by Thebes and its temples, and Nekabit and Zobu watched over the safety of Egypt. Nekabit soon lost its position as a frontier town, and that portion of Nubia lying between Gebel Silsili and the rapids of Syene formed a kind of border province, of which Nubitambos was the principal sanctuary and Abu Elephantini the fortress. Beyond this were the barbarians and those inaccessible regions whence the Nile descended upon our earth. The organization of the delta, it would appear, was more slowly brought about. It must have greatly resembled that of the lowlands of equatorial Africa, towards the confluence of the Bahr el Abayad and the Bahr el Ghazal, great tracts of mud, difficult to describe as either solid or liquid, marshes dotted here and there with sandy islets, bristling with papyrus reeds, water lilies, and enormous plants through which the arms of the Nile sluggishly pushed their ever-shifting course, low-lying wastes intersected with streams and pools, unfit for cultivation and scarcely available for pasturing cattle. The population of such districts, engaged in a ceaseless struggle with nature, always preserved relatively ruder manners and a more rugged and savage character, impatient of all authority. The conquest of this region began from the outer edge only. A few principalities were established at the apex of the delta in localities where the soil had earliest been won from the river. It appears that one of these divisions embraced the country south of and between the bifurcation of the Nile. Anu of the north, the Heliopolis of the Greeks, was its capital. In very early times, the principality was divided and formed three new states, independent of each other. Those of Anu and the Haunch were opposite to each other, the first on the Arabian, the latter on the Libyan bank of the Nile. The district of the White Wall marched with that of the Haunch on the north, and on the south touched the territory of the Oleander. Further down the river, between the more important branches, the governors of Sais and of Bubastis, of Athribis and of Busiris, shared among themselves the primitive delta. Two frontier provinces of unequal size, the Arabian on the east in the Wadi Tumilat, and the Libyan on the west to the south of Lake Mareotis, defended the approaches of the country from the attacks of Asiatic Bedouins and African nomads. The marshes of the interior and the dunes of the littoral were not conducive to the development of any great industry or civilization. They only comprised tracts of thinly populated country, like the principalities of the Harpoon and of the Cow, and others whose limits varied from century to century with the changing course of the river. The work of rendering the marshes salubrious and of digging canals, which had been so successful in the Nile Valley, was less efficacious in the delta and proceeded more slowly. Here, the embankments were not supported by a mountain chain. They continued at random across the marshes, cut at every turn to admit the waters of a canal or an arm of the river. The waters left their usual bed at the least disturbing influence and made a fresh course for themselves across the country. If the inundation were delayed, the soft and badly drained soil again became a slough. Should it last but a few weeks longer than usual, the work of several generations was for a long time undone. The delta of one epoch rarely presented the same aspect as that of previous periods, and northern Egypt never became as fully mistress of her soil as the Egypt of the south. These first principalities, however small they may seem to us, were still too large to remain undivided. In those times of slow communication, the strong pull a capital city had over its provinces didn't reach very far. The people living near enough to Siut to come into town for a few hours in the morning and return to their villages in the evening, after business was done, wouldn't want to leave the rule of the prince who governed there. On the other hand, those who lived outside that limited circle were forced to find other places to gather, to attend justice, to sacrifice together to their national gods, and to trade their farm produce and local goods. Towns that were lucky enough to become such meeting points naturally became rivals to the capital. Their chiefs, along with the districts whose populations, so to speak, revolved around them, tended to become independent of the prince. When they succeeded, they often kept the old name for the new state they created, slightly changed by adding an adjective. The original territory of Siut was thus divided into three distinct communities. Two remained loyal to the old tree emblem, the Upper Terebinth, with Siut itself at its center, and the Lower Terebinth, with Cusut to the north. The third, in the south and east, took as their totem the immortal serpent that lived in their mountains, and called themselves the Serpent Mountain, with the chief town being that of the Sparrow Hawk. The territory of the Oleander, by its division, produced the principality of the Upper Oleander, that of the Lower Oleander, and that of the Knife. The territory of the Harpoon in the delta split into the Western and Eastern Harpoon. This division, in most cases, couldn't have happened without struggles, but it did take place. All principalities of any significant size had to submit to it, no matter how much they tried to avoid it. This partitioning continued as opportunities arose, until all of Egypt, except the semi-desert areas around the cataract, became a collection of small states, almost equal in power and population. The Greeks called them nomes, and we've borrowed the word from them. The natives called them by several names, the oldest term being newt, which can be translated as domain, and the most common name in recent times being hospu, meaning district. The number of nomes varied considerably over centuries. Hieroglyphic monuments and classical authors sometimes set them at 36, sometimes 40, sometimes 44, or even 50. The little we know of their history, so far, explains why this varied. Constantly fought over by the princely families who owned them, the nomes were alternately humbled and exalted by civil wars, marriages, and conquests, which continually caused them to pass into new hands, either whole or divided. The Egyptians, whom we tend to consider a people who respected established order and preserved ancient tradition, proved to be as restless and as prone to change or destroy the work of the past as the most inconsistent of our modern nations. The distance in time that separates them from us, and the almost complete absence of documents, gives them an appearance of immobility, by which we are liable to be unconsciously deceived. When the monuments still existing are unearthed, their history will show the same complexity of incidents, the same unrest, the same instability that we suspect or know to have characterized most other Oriental nations. One thing alone remained stable among them amidst so many revolutions, and that prevented them from losing their individuality and merging into a common unity. This was the belief in and worship of one particular deity. If the small capitals of the petty states whose origin is lost in a distant past, Edfu and Dendra, Nekabit and Buto, Sufk, Thynis, Kmunu, Sais, Bubastis, Athribis, had only possessed the importance that came from an ambitious petty prince or the wealth of their inhabitants, they would never have survived safely through the long centuries of existence they enjoyed from the beginning to the end of Egyptian history. Fortune raised their chiefs, some even to the rank of world rulers, and in turn brought them low. But alongside the earthly ruler, whose glory was too often eclipsed, in each nome was enthroned a divine ruler, a deity, a god of the domain, Nutter-Nuadi, whose greatness never perished. Princely families might be exiled or die out, the territory might shrink or grow, the town might double in size and population or fall into ruins. The god lived on through all these changes, and his presence alone preserved intact the rights of the state over which he reigned as sovereign. If any disaster befell his worshippers, his temple was the spot where the survivors of the catastrophe rallied around him, their religion preventing them from mixing with the inhabitants of neighboring towns and getting lost among them. The survivors multiplied with that extraordinary rapidity characteristic of the Egyptian fellah, and a few years of peace were enough to repair losses that seemed irreparable. Local religion was the tie that bound together the diverse elements of which each principality was composed, and as long as it remained, the nomes remained. When it vanished, they disappeared with it.